August 14th, 1945. Late afternoon. The sun hangs low and heavy over the sprawling assembly yards of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, casting long amber shadows across row upon row of low-slung wooden barracks. The air smells of cut grass and diesel fuel and something else, something that has no name in the vocabulary of the men who breathe it in, something that might simply be called plenty. A group of Japanese prisoners of war stand near the perimeter fence, not attempting escape, not shouting defiance, not doing anything that their captors might have expected. They are standing still, looking. A freight train passes on the distant rail line, its cars loaded with timber and steel and manufactured goods, stretching so far into the horizon that it seems to have no end. One of the prisoners, a man named Kenji Watanabe, a former corporal from the Imperial Japanese Army's 32nd Division, 24 years old, a school teacher's son from Nagasaki, watches that train until it disappears. He has not spoken in several minutes. His camp interpreter will later record that Watanabe turned away from the fence with an expression that could not be described as defeat. It was something quieter than defeat, something more unsettling. It was the expression of a man whose world has just become too large for the map he was given. He will be permitted to write a letter home 3 days later. He will spend most of the allowed words not on his own condition, not on news of the war, not even on the family he misses with a depth that defies language. He will spend most of those words trying to describe something he has seen, something that should not, according to everything he has ever been taught, exist. And he will not be alone. Across dozens of prisoner of war camps scattered throughout the American interior, from the desert installations of Arizona to the flat agricultural plains of Nebraska, from the industrial corridors of Ohio to the humid river valleys of Louisiana, tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war are, in these months of 1944 and 1945, confronting the same impossible problem. They have been captured by a nation that their government, their military, their school curriculum, and their entire cultural apparatus has described in one consistent way. They have arrived in that nation. And the nation before their eyes bears almost no resemblance to the one inside their heads. The letters they write, many censored, many intercepted, many archived and forgotten for decades, constitute one of the most extraordinary documentary records of the Second World War. They are not propaganda documents. They are not performances. They are private attempts by human beings to reconcile experience with belief. And in that reconciliation, they reveal something profound, not just about Japan and America in the 1940s, but about the nature of ideology itself, about what happens to a human mind when reality refuses to cooperate with certainty. This is the story of what they saw, and what they could not bring themselves to unsee. To understand the magnitude of the psychological rupture these men experienced, it is necessary to understand what they had been told. Not casually told, not suggested or implied, but systematically, rigorously, institutionally told, from the earliest years of their schooling through every level of their military indoctrination. The Imperial Japanese military educational apparatus had constructed a very specific portrait of America and Americans. That portrait had been refined and sharpened through the late 1930s and into the war years with considerable deliberateness. According to official doctrine, the United States was a nation in decline, morally bankrupt, racially chaotic, spiritually empty. American soldiers, the doctrine held, were weak men drawn from a weak society that had grown soft on comfort and individualism. They lacked the discipline of the imperial soldier. They lacked Bushido, the warrior spirit that transforms suffering into strength. American material abundance, to the extent that it was acknowledged at all, was framed as evidence of decadence rather than power, as a symptom of a civilization that had traded virtue for convenience. This was not merely official messaging, it was woven into the texture of Japanese education. Professor John Dower, in his landmark work, War Without Mercy, documents how Japanese schoolchildren in the late 1930s and early 1940s were taught to regard America and American culture with a specific mixture of contempt and righteous opposition. The American was understood as kichiku, a concept roughly translating to demon or beast, not in a literal supernatural sense, but in a moral one. The enemy was capable of cruelty. The enemy was dishonorable. The enemy could not be trusted, reasoned with, or respected as a warrior. Military training reinforced these lessons with additional layers. Soldiers were told that American forces would torture prisoners, that surrender was both dishonorable and practically suicidal, that the America of the newsreels and the Hollywood films that had trickled into Japanese culture before the war was a fabrication, an advertising campaign for a hollow civilization. Imperial Japanese soldiers were reminded, repeatedly, that they fought not just for territory or military objectives, but for a superior way of being human. Records declassified from the United States Office of War Information in the post-war years reveal that American intelligence analysts were well aware of these beliefs. A 1944 psychological warfare assessment noted that Japanese prisoners arrived in American custody in a state of extreme psychological contradiction. They had been prepared for execution or torture upon capture, and were instead encountering something their training had given them no framework to. Process. The assessment further noted that this cognitive gap represented both a challenge and potentially a strategic asset. The challenge was that many prisoners refused to trust what they saw. The strategic asset was that some of them, eventually, began to write about it. The first thing many of them noticed was the food. This is not a trivial detail. By 1944, the average Japanese soldier in the Pacific Theater was operating under severe nutritional stress. Supply lines had been systematically disrupted by American naval dominance. Malnutrition was not a peripheral problem. It was a defining condition of the Imperial Japanese military experience in the war's later years. General Douglas MacArthur's command estimated that by mid-1944, malnutrition and disease, rather than direct combat, were responsible for the majority of Japanese military casualties in the Pacific. Soldiers had been surviving on reduced rations of rice, dried fish, and whatever local forage was available in the jungles and island landscapes where they fought. Many arrived in prisoner-of-war camps visibly malnourished. And then came the meals. A prisoner identified in camp, records only as T. Ishikawa, a former sergeant captured during the fighting on Leyte in the Philippines and transferred to a camp in Arizona in early 1945, wrote in his first permitted letter, portions of which were preserved in Military Intelligence Service translation files, that he had initially believed the first meal he was served was a deliberate demonstration, a performance of abundance designed to psychologically unsettle prisoners. He described white bread, not the hardtack or pressed rice he had grown accustomed to, but soft white bread, beef, vegetables that had been cooked in something he could not identify but which tasted, he wrote, like something from a celebration. Coffee with sugar. The meal was not the meal of a prisoner. It was, by the standards of wartime Japan, by the standards of civilian Japan in those years of rationing and shortage, a meal of extraordinary opulence. Ishikawa wrote that he ate carefully, slowly, certain that there was some deception being prepared. There was none. But what stopped these men most completely, what appears again and again in the translated letters and intelligence summaries preserved in archives at the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, was not any single item of food or any single act of decency. It was the cities. It was the infrastructure. It was the cumulative, overwhelming evidence of an industrial civilization operating at a scale that the men had not been given any vocabulary to comprehend. Prisoners transferred through American cities, whether by train through Chicago, through Los Angeles, through Buffalo, or Detroit, or Kansas City, were not shielded from what they passed through. And what they passed through unmade them. Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka, whose letters were preserved in a collection of intercepted correspondence held by the Military Intelligence Service Language School and later cataloged by historians at the Japanese American National Museum, wrote about passing through a Midwestern city by train. The city is not specified in the translated records, and watching the lights of it spread from horizon to horizon in the evening dark. He wrote that he had counted for a time the illuminated windows he could see. He stopped counting. He wrote that in Japan, In those years of wartime rationing, lights were extinguished at night as a matter of civilian defense protocol. Here, they burned as though there were no war at all. He wrote words that the American intelligence translator rendered as, "I began to feel that I had not understood what country I was fighting." The intelligence community found these letters remarkable for reasons that went beyond their psychological interest. Lieutenant Commander Cecil Coggins, a Navy psychiatrist who worked extensively with Japanese prisoners of war, and whose observations were compiled in a 1945 report titled Japanese Prisoner of War Morale, documented what he called a consistent pattern of ideological dislocation among prisoners who had been transported through or near American urban centers. Coggins noted that the visible infrastructure of American cities, the roads, the bridges, the factory complexes visible from rail lines, the sheer density of commercial and industrial activity appeared to produce a specific psychological response that differed from ordinary culture shock. Ordinary culture shock, Coggins observed, occurs when a person encounters a world that is unfamiliar. What Japanese prisoners were experiencing was different. They were encountering a world that directly, factually contradicted specific claims their government had made. They were not merely surprised by American culture. They were being given empirical evidence that they had been lied to. And the men who grasped this fact fully, Coggins wrote, exhibited a disorientation that went beyond surprise and approached something closer to grief. Grief is the right word. Because to truly absorb what they were seeing, the factories that seemed to extend for miles along river valleys, the freight yards piled with manufactured goods, the grocery stores visible from prisoner transport vehicles stocked with items that had become scarce or non-existent in wartime Japan. The ordinary American civilians who appeared neither brutalized by war nor hollowed out by deprivation, but simply going about the ordinary business of ordinary life, to truly absorb all of this was to confront a devastating implication. Japan could not win this war, had never been able to win this war. The numbers, the tonnage, the sheer physical volume of what these men were seeing told them this with a clarity that no military analysis could have conveyed. They had fought for years and died by hundreds of thousands against a nation whose productive capacity was so vast that the war barely registered as a constraint on daily civilian life. A letter written by a prisoner identified as M. Fujiwara and preserved in the archives of the National Archives Record Group 389, which holds records of the American Prisoner of War Information Bureau, attempts to describe what it felt like to stand in the middle of an American agricultural landscape and understand its implications. Fujiwara had been a farmer's son in Shizuoka Prefecture. He understood land. He understood harvest. He wrote of seeing American farmland in the summer of 1944, fields of corn stretching to the edges of vision, mechanized equipment moving through them, silos of a size he had no comparison for, and wrote, "I thought of the rice paddies at home. I thought of my father's hands. And I understood something I cannot say aloud." The censors let that line through. Perhaps they understood too. What happened to these perceptions over time is as important as the perceptions themselves. It would be tempting to assume that the dissonance resolved quickly, that men simply adapted, updated their beliefs, and moved on. The historical record suggests the process was far more complex, far more painful, and far more varied than that. Some prisoners refused to update their beliefs at all. The psychological cost of accepting the full implication of what they were seeing, that the ideology that had organized their entire lives, that had given meaning to years of suffering, that had defined the sacrifice of their fallen comrades, was too high. These men developed elaborate explanations. What they were seeing was a staged performance, or it was specific to America's enormous territory, or it was a temporary condition that Japan's spirit could still overcome. Camp administrators noted that these prisoners were often the most agitated, the most hostile, and paradoxically the most miserable. Others broke more openly. Cecil Coggins documented cases of prisoners who, after weeks or months in American custody, requested to speak with American military personnel not about surrender terms or repatriation, but about what they were going to tell their families, about whether the Japan they had left still existed in the form they remembered, about what meaning could be salvaged from experiences that their new understanding of reality had retroactively complicated. And some wrote letters that tried, in the limited words and the observed privacy of censored correspondence, to send home something more important than news. Something more important than assurances of health and survival. They tried to send home a warning. Or, perhaps more accurately, a revision. A prisoner who signed his name as Yoichi Matsumoto, captured at Okinawa in the summer of 1945 and transferred to a facility in the American South, wrote to his younger brother in a letter translated and archived by military intelligence service personnel, "Do not believe everything you are told." About the nature of our enemy. "I have seen things that I think you will not be permitted to know for some time. There is no shame in what I tell you. The shame, if there is shame, belongs elsewhere." The censors removed the final sentence before the letter was sent, but they preserved the original in their files, and it survived. The objects that appear in these letters, the specific things that Japanese prisoners fixated on, returned to, tried to communicate across the distance of ocean and war and censorship, form a kind of unintentional inventory of American industrial civilization as it appeared to men who had never expected to see it from the inside. The automobile appears with striking frequency, not just as a vehicle, but as a quantity. Prisoners transferred through American cities remarked on the sheer number of private automobiles, not military vehicles, not government transport, but privately owned cars driven by ordinary people to ordinary destinations. In Japan in 1945, private automobile ownership was vanishingly rare. The sight of American parking lots, of ordinary factories where workers arrived by private car, of families loading groceries into vehicles they personally owned, struck prisoners with the force of revelation. One translation summary notes that a prisoner asked his interpreter, without irony, whether the United States government had special programs to lend cars to citizens for the duration of the war. He could not conceive of a civilian population that simply owned them. And then there was the size of things. The bridges, wider than the main roads in the towns many prisoners had grown up in. The buildings, not just the famous towers of New York or Chicago, which existed in some attenuated form in their imagination, but the ordinary buildings, the warehouses and hospitals and schools and government offices of ordinary mid-sized American cities, built with materials and to scales that spoke of a civilization that had never had to make the choices that shortage forces, that had never had to decide, at the level of national policy, whether this region would have a hospital or that region would have a rail line. Both. Always both. More than both. The food remained, throughout all the letters and all the testimony, the most persistent symbol. Not because food was the most important thing the prisoners witnessed, but because it was the most intimate. Because eating is the most bodily form of knowing. Because a man who has been hungry understands abundance not as an abstraction, but as a physical truth experienced in his own tissues. A bowl of American cornflakes with cold milk and sugar, described in meticulous detail by a prisoner named Sato Kenji in a letter that somehow passed the censors unaltered, became, in that letter, in those careful words, not a breakfast, but a testimony. Not a meal, but a document. "I ate it slowly," Kenji wrote. "I wanted to understand where it came from. What kind of country makes this every morning, for everyone, and then makes more? What kind of country indeed?" By the war's end in August 1945, approximately 5,424 Japanese military personnel were held in prisoner of war facilities within the continental United States, according to records compiled by the Office of the Provost Marshal General. This number was vastly smaller than the hundreds of thousands of German POWs held in American camps during the same period, a reflection of the battlefield reality that Japanese military culture made surrender, in most circumstances, functionally impossible. The men who were captured were therefore a particular subset, men who had been rendered unconscious or incapacitated before they could act on their training, or men who had, in the final exhaustion of impossible situations, chosen life over the doctrine that demanded otherwise. They were, as a group, not representative of the Imperial Japanese military as a whole. But the documentary record they left is extraordinary precisely because of its specificity, because these were men who had fully absorbed the ideology they were being asked to revise, who had fought for it, suffered for it, and arrived in American captivity expecting to die for their defiance of it. That men like these would write letters expressing what they wrote is not a small historical footnote. Historian Roger Dingman, whose research into Japanese POW experiences produced significant documentation of prisoner psychology during this period, notes that American intelligence officials were, in some respects, confounded by the letters. They had expected, in the early stages of the war, that Japanese prisoners would be resistant, hostile, or psychologically shattered. Many were initially. What officials had not fully anticipated was the specific form that adaptation sometimes took. Not submission, not defeat, but a kind of sorrowful recalibration. The prisoners who wrote most extensively about American cities and American abundance were not writing propaganda. They were not writing what their captors wanted to hear. They were writing what they could not avoid thinking. And what they could not avoid thinking was costing them something. The organized interior world that ideology provides. The comfort of knowing who the enemy is and what the enemy represents. To lose that is to lose a kind of home, even when the home was built on falsehood. That loss is evident in the letters. The tone is not triumphant and not submissive. It is something more human than either. It is the tone of a person trying to be honest about something painful, in the limited words available to them, in the knowledge that those words may never arrive. The freight train at Camp McCoy disappeared into the Wisconsin horizon on that August afternoon in 1945. Kenji Watanabe turned away from the fence, and 3 days later, he sat down to write. He wrote within the permitted word count. He wrote within the observed privacy of wartime censorship. He wrote knowing that his words would be read by strangers before they reached, if they ever reached, the family in Nagasaki who he did not yet know had survived. The bomb had fallen on August 9th. Watanabe would not learn for months whether anyone he loved was alive. He wrote about the train. He wrote about the fields visible from the camp. He wrote about a meal he had been served and could not fully account for. And then, near the end of the permitted space, he wrote something that the censors preserved in their archive alongside their translation notes and their assessments of military intelligence value. He wrote, in the translation rendered by a Nisei military interpreter, whose name appears in the record only as R. Yamamoto. I used to think I knew what America was. I knew its name and I knew what they told us about its nature. Now I am inside it, and I find it is not what its name meant in the language of my education. I am not certain what this means for the things I believed before. I am not certain what to do with what I now know. I hope you are well. I hope you are alive. I hope that when we are permitted to speak again without censors and without distance between us, you will have the patience to hear what I have seen and what I have had to revise. The letter was approved for delivery. Whether it arrived and whether the people it was addressed to lived to read it, the archive does not record. But Kenji Watanabe's words survived, and in surviving, they remind us of something important, something that the history of this war, with its immense scales of production and destruction, can sometimes obscure. Ideology is not merely a political phenomenon, it is a psychological architecture. It is the invisible structure inside which a human being organizes experience, assigns meaning, and orients toward the future. When reality dismantles that architecture, not through argument or persuasion, but through the sheer, undeniable presence of things as they actually are, the person inside it is left not just unconvinced, but temporarily homeless. What Japanese prisoners of war found in America was not only abundance. What they found was the particular kind of disorientation that comes from discovering that the story you were given about the world was not the world. They found it in cornfields and freight yards and parking lots and hospital wards and grocery stores and the soft white bread placed in front of them without explanation. They found it in the behavior of their captors, who were supposed to be brutal and were often merely ordinary. They found it in the lights of cities that burned all night because no one had told them to go dark. They found it in the wideness of a country that their maps had never been large enough to contain. Perhaps that is the deepest truth embedded in those censored letters, in those careful words sent across an ocean from the interior of a nation that had defied every expectation. The men who wrote them were not converted. They were not conquered in any interior sense. They were simply confronted, not with an argument, but with evidence. Not with a counter-ideology, but with a freight train that had no visible end. And that, finally, is what abundance means at its most consequential. Not comfort, not luxury, not ease, but the kind of material reality that speaks for itself even to those who have been most thoroughly taught not to hear it. The kind of truth that crosses the censors' desks in the ocean and the silence between people who have been enemies, and arrives, changed in transit, reduced to what the permitted words allow, still carrying, in its careful sentences and its quietly revised certainties, the unmistakable sound of a human mind opening, like a door that has been locked from the inside for a very long time. Opening at last, not because someone forced it, because of what was on the other side,